Because if you don't know your history, you don't know your future. And your future is to be what happened the early days under Martin and Jimmy Murphy, without doubt. And telling them that what Jimmy did about planting seeds about the history, that is the most important thing you can do with young players coming to Man United. Tell them what their expectation is, to realise the expectation. For a point for Man United, there's no point for Bolton Wanderers or Bury or Rochdale. It's a point for the biggest club in the world.
So, the early days of Sir Alex Ferguson at Manchester United, or we should say Alex Ferguson at Manchester United, or we should even go further beyond that, Paddy, and talk about Alex Ferguson, regular Alex Ferguson, before Manchester United, before Aberdeen. Let's go all the way back to St Mirren. Let's disregard the world class striker that he thought he was as a player. And
he wasn't bad. Let's be fair about this. His stats are very good. He was a goal scorer, a poacher, a fighter, a teammate of his, John Gregg, who played briefly with him at Rangers, said that he played against him as well. And he said when you felt the force of Alex Ferguson's elbows, it was like being stabbed. I think that conjures up an image of a part of his game. But you're quite right to move on to his management career, which it started very briefly at East Stirlingshire, the tiny club in the town of Falkirk, obviously the second club in Falkirk. And you really couldn't have had a more humble start. But he was instantly successful in galvanising East Stirling, and it was very soon after that St Mirren came calling for him. And this was the first marriage made in heaven, really, because it's fairly well known that and we'll talk about this, that Alex Ferguson and Manchester United were made for each other, because Manchester United were based on the Matt Busby principles of build from within, build your own players, create a family of your own players. And it was the same at St Mirren. They'd already started a youth policy when they beckoned Alex Ferguson to make the short journey from East Stirling to Paisley.
Incredible when you look at the numbers, really. They won Scottish First Division, which was the Premier Division already existed in Scotland at that time. But when you look at the numbers, Paddy, he was there for 4 years. They won the First Division in 1977. The average age of that team was 19. The captain, Tony Fitzpatrick, was 20. They were renowned for playing exciting football. But we're talking about, people compare eras, and that's something that we'll probably be doing as we go along this. But bringing in an average age team of sort of 19, 20 in this day and age, you could conceive it. You could see that it could be the case. And even 10 years ago, maybe 20 years ago, you could say, oh, that's a bit young, but definitely with some experience around them. Yeah. The fledgling team, for example, is 23, 24. So to go back another 20 years before that, an average age of 19.
Tony Fitzpatrick, when they won that title, it was 20, I think you said. Yeah. He was actually a teenager when Ferguson made him the captain. But it was a prolific youth policy. As I say, it was obviously good before, because it had produced not only Fitzpatrick, but a centre-half called Bobby Reid, who actually his career was ended by injury, but he could have been a considerable player, and one or two others. But Ferguson just ramped things up, and in the end, all sorts of notables came out of the St Mirren youth policy after, while it was still producing. After Ferguson had left, Frank McAvenny, McAvenny later, actually, Billy Stark, who Ferguson signed later for Aberdeen, all really, really good players. Peter Weir, who later joined Ferguson and took part in the fantastic European Cup Winners' Cup triumph of 1983. when they beat Real Madrid. Weir was one of the stars of that team. So, I mean, you could go on and on and on about the players that this youth policy produced. And it was, yes, Ferguson inherited it, but he certainly nurtured it in conjunction with the scout that he got at the time, a lad called Archibald. What was he called? But he was known as, anyway, he was known, whether it was his lack of hair or a shortened form of Archibald, he was known as Baldy. And Baldy and Alex Ferguson had I suppose he was the Eric Harrison of the time, Baldy, and they had quite a good relationship. And Ferguson actually mentioned him in one of his autobiographies as one of probably the most remarkable of all the many scouts he'd used in his career.
Yeah. From St Mirren, he went to Aberdeen. There was some discrepancy whether or not he was actually dismissed or whether he'd been poached by Aberdeen.
Oh, he'd been poached.
but he certainly ended up there.
He lost the court case anyway. And no, he was definitely poached. I can tell you the story if you like. Aberdeen. He claimed that he'd been dismissed by St Mirren and sued them. But in actual fact, St Mirren had been tipped off the Aberdeen by a journalist friend of Ferguson's who seems to have been playing off both sides, both Ferguson and St Mirren, called Jim Rodger. And the late Jim Rodger was more than a journalist, a lot more. He would arrange transfers of changes of manager, and undoubtedly he was involved in Ferguson's move from St Mirren to Aberdeen, and unfortunately for Ferguson, as I say, he made sure that not just Ferguson but St Mirren were aware of it all the way through. So he definitely was poached. There's no question about that.
What kind of impact did he have on Aberdeen from the start?
Well, Aberdeen, a little bit like St Mirren, were prepared for Ferguson. They had already instituted a youth policy. They had some good young players in the team. Alex McLeish being a very good example of that, and a lot of it was, the youth policy was very good, and it extended already into Glasgow, Ferguson's native area. And also the idea that Aberdeen were a nothing club, when Ferguson took them over, is fanciful as well, because they actually, in the season before Ferguson joined, after Billy McNeill had gone back to Celtic as manager, Billy McNeill actually got them into second in the league. They pushed Rangers pretty hard in both the league and the cup. So this was not, and their average crowd was something like 18,000. So this was not a nothing club when Ferguson arrived. But he, once again, as at St Mirren, he made the youth policy more aggressive and more wide-ranging, and he undoubtedly galvanised the players. He was an inspiration right from the start. I mean, in Scotland, it was common knowledge that this was one of, well, he wouldn't have got the Aberdeen job if he hadn't been top-class potential.
Yeah, but it's like you said, the way that he started, because of the expectation there, Aberdeen finished fourth in his first season in charge. They got to the semi-finals of domestic cups, and that was seen as a little difficult start, really, but it was the second season where he really kicked on, and they got to the League Cup final. They lost that time, but they won the league. And
I think winning the league was the startling thing, and it was because, I don't think a club other than Rangers Hearts had a period, Hearts and Hibs after the war, but historically it was almost unheard of for clubs from outside the old firm to do it, and I don't think anyone has done it quite as sustained in the history of Scottish football, has mounted quite as sustained a challenge, or indeed ascendancy over the old firm, as Ferguson's Aberdeen did.
Yeah, a few weeks before they won the first title, they played against Hibs. I mentioned this because they drew 1-1 in the game, and Willie Miller for Aberdeen, he was having an argument with Hibs winger George Best, and Miller was sledging George, telling him that he wasn't the player that he once was. And at the end of the game, Best throws a bob back at Miller, and he says, "Haha, you've lost. You've drawn the game. That's going to cost you the title." Best goes back to California, where he's living, playing for San Jose. A few weeks later, Aberdeen win their first title under Ferguson with a 5-0 win at Easter Road. But Best a little too far for the salt to be rubbed into the wound, but I think Miller made his point.
I think he had. It was a terrific team. That, I mean, based on the triangle at the back of two centre backs. McLeish, who we have just mentioned earlier, Willie Miller, and behind them Jim Leighton. So it was a terrific foundation. But of course there was quality going forward as well. I've already mentioned Peter Weir, the outside left, who he poached from his poached is too strong. Who he brought from his previous clubs at Mirren. On the other flank, the outstanding Gordon Strachan was Mark McGee at centre forward, who Ferguson, was a good player when he arrived at Aberdeen, but Ferguson made him an outstanding player who famously terrorised Real Madrid in that European Cup Winners' Cup final. There were good players all over the field. The right back Stuart Kennedy, not known in England, but massively respected in Scotland as probably second only to Danny McGrain third only to Danny McGrain and Sandy Jardine, as fullbacks of that era, Scottish fullbacks of that era. Kennedy was an outstanding player. The McMaster at left back, constructive left back who could hit long passes that reminded you of Glenn Hoddle. I mean, he was an amazing long passer, McMaster. So they had, I've missed a few out. Eric Black, very, very intelligent centre forward, not particularly tall, but good in the air, and on the ground. Scored also against Real Madrid. So there was, and again I've probably missed some out, but there was quality all the way through the side. But above all, especially after Ferguson, there was belief.
Yeah, and as well, Paddy, the thing to mention about this is that it was an accomplished set of results and performances. This wasn't a flash in the pan. He was building something. When they beat Bayern Munich on the run to the final, when they beat Real Madrid in the final, you looked at Aberdeen like serious competitors. They weren't there to make up the numbers.
That's right. Yeah, I was at the Bayern Munich game in Pataudry, and it was a fantastic performance. One of the outstanding moments, of course, was again had the mark of Ferguson on it, because it was a bit of kidology at a free kick. I don't know if you remember, where one player, Strachan, was involved in this. One player went to take it, stopped, pretended to have an argument with Strachan, and Strachan was gesticulating, and then suddenly whipped in a perfect ball for Alex McLeish, who knew exactly what was going to happen. And bang, a header was in the net. And Bayern Munich were almost saying, well, that's a bit unsporting, But it was, that was that kind of craftiness and street wisdom that later came to Manchester United was very much evident in that Aberdeen team. But they were a band of warriors as well. And that, in a way, very much comparable to the first great side that Ferguson was to build at United, with some really bristly characters. I remember, and you mentioned the Bayern Munich match, as the teams went out in Munich, one of the Bayern Munich players later wrote a book in which he said, as soon as we saw this team, we were a little bit, we thought, what have we taken on? We looked across at the Aberdeen team, and none of them seemed to have any teeth. Which is a great tribute to the Scottish dental system, perhaps, or maybe to do with the amount of sugary deep-fried Mars bars they'd been eating. But it was true. And McLeish told me that story. And they were a band of a band of warriors without any question.
A year later, Aberdeen retained the Scottish Cup, a 1-0 win over Rangers. Ferguson afterwards, he was infamously seen on television describing the performance as disgraceful.
Yeah.
He later backtracked on it, but this was an indication of the standards he was now holding.
That's true. And what's more, when I spoke to Martin Edwards about the recruitment of Alex Ferguson, he actually mentioned that, and I was surprised. He said, he talked about, we knew he was a youth development man, but, we knew he could build football teams. But one thing that stuck in my mind, said Martin, was that bollocking that he gave the players after they'd won the cup. And he said, wow, I thought, what standards this guy has. You've not just got to win, but you've got to win well. And he said that was a factor in along with Bobby Charlton's advocacy of Ferguson, in them deciding to make him on a short list of one. There was talk of Terry Venables, but he was really on a short list of one, Ferguson.
Yeah.
When United came calling. But that's interesting. He apologised for that because the players were tired and they'd won the game. It's not as if they'd. And he said. There was another funny story about that. I can't remember who said it, but he was still seething on the bus going back to Aberdeen. And it was a long journey for these poor players who thought, well, what more can we do than win? And he said, he pointed at McLeish and Miller. He said, you two were the only two that didn't let us down. The rest of you were a disgrace. And there was just silence, and the bus finally gets into towards Aberdeen. And one of the players, it was probably Strachan, who said, we'll not be going on an open-top bus down Union Street, Aberdeen tomorrow. It'll just be Miller and McLeish on a tandem.
That was that's Ferguson. I guess at that point that's a sign of his ambition and sort of acknowledgement that this Aberdeen side had done great, but there's a limit to how far they were going to go. And obviously he was courted by a number of English clubs.
Wolves among them.
Yeah, Arsenal, Spurs as well. Everyone
Correct.
sort of wanted him to go down there because his star was shining so brightly, and obviously he was at the World Cup as well after what happened to Jock Stein. But yeah, like you mentioned, it was Manchester United where he was going. Before we get on to United, just one last thing. Just the theory of the best manager in the world versus the right man for the job and that conversation. Now, British football was much more insular back then, and perhaps a good cause, because all the European champions that were coming from England, you've got Aberdeen's success, obviously, in the European Cup Winners' Cup. And there was a great track record of great Scottish managers as well, really in its heyday at this point. But I just want to put it to you about Alex Ferguson being the best manager in the world versus the right man for the job. Is it difficult to, like these days, you've got Pep Guardiola, you've got Zinedine Zidane, you've got Bielsa, you've got all these coaches around the world who we've seen go to different places, so you're able to make an easier assessment. Difficult to do it in those days, but how would you rank Ferguson's promise at that time?
Oh yes, I think he was. I think his reputation, the European Cup Winners' Cup win, had cemented his reputation in Europe, much as the UEFA Cup win of 2003 established Jose Mourinho. He didn't become famous throughout Britain until a year later, after his victory at Old Trafford, followed by Champions League victory for Porto. But Ferguson's status was much as Mourinho's was in 2003, when he'd won the UEFA Cup, and now you look to see what he could do next. So, yeah, I think among the cognoscenti, he was definitely known. And I mean, the other thing was, of course, that Terry Venables. It was at a stage that the stock of the English coach was the British coach was so high that Terry Venables got the Barcelona job and so on. And I mean, it was Terry Venables, and you know, Ferguson was sort of bracketed with Terry Venables as, you know, the kind of man who could go. The speculation concerned Venables as well as Ferguson, while Ron Atkinson was a sort of lame duck manager, you know, dependent on results day by day. As I mean, we are talking now in November to 2020, and much as poor Ole Gunnar Solskjaer is now. So it's his status was definitely high. It wasn't. I mean, managers weren't probably seen as gods in the same way as they are now. I mean, Guardiola, Klopp. I mean, these men are you know, almost walk on water for the to look at the publicity they get, and sometimes with good reason. But managers were seen much more in proportion in those days, and that's how you should look at Ferguson. There weren't crowds walking down, you know, marching round Albert Square, Manchester, saying, "We must have Ferguson now."
No, but like you said, his reputation was certainly in high stock.
You know, when you've overturned Bayern Munich and Real Madrid in a European competition, you're well known, you're well respected.
Yeah. November 1986. You mentioned, and it's quite right, that there was only one man for the job, and it was Alex Ferguson. Bobby Charlton had already sounded him out and become friendly with him at the World Cup.
Yeah.
Beforehand, it had always been a debate at United. There'd always been many candidates, and many times they hadn't got the first choice. You know, they'd gone for Jock Stein, they'd gone for Laurie McMenemy, they'd gone for all these these coaches, and I think even Sexton turned them down before he went to them. So there were all these different coaches who'd come, who were second and third choice, and perhaps in a way, I don't know, Paddy, if you agree with this, but perhaps in a way that had been a reason for why there was something so disjointed about United's identity. I know Doherty got there for a little while, but perhaps because United didn't know what they want, it was difficult to know.
Well, you're absolutely right there, that it needed a special kind of person like Alex Ferguson to take that on. Bear in mind, you said Sexton turned United down once. Stein obviously didn't go there for one reason or another. Laurie McMenemy turned them down because he thought, this job's going to chew me up. And if you look at it, you're quite right, they didn't know what they wanted. In came Franco Farrell, you know, who I suppose was a little bit like Ferguson. He'd done well at a slightly lower level, very well with Leicester. He was a man who could project the club, dignity and so on. And then they go for Doherty, who is a bit more rough-hewn, wisecracking, but you know, fantastic, you know, exciting football. Sorry, that was after Dave Sexton. Dave was, you know, Mr. Respectability. So they seem to be swaying from one character of manager to another. And I suppose Ron Atkinson, who has many virtues as a manager, tremendous virtues as a manager, but youth development isn't one of them. You definitely couldn't say that he's a holistic manager. You know, it was the first team, that was what mattered. And to Ron, and entertaining the punters. Now, Ferguson was very much the opposite, so they went for somebody else. But it was the best decision that they made to go back, to find someone who was as close to Matt Busby as they could possibly get, someone who would build the whole club. And in fact, that's what happened when Ferguson had his interview, such as it was, with you know, Martin Edwards, Bobby Charlton, and I think Mike Edelson also was there when they had an interview at a relative, a member of Ferguson's sort of extended family, just south of Glasgow, and it was just a meeting of minds. The United party went up there with the intention of saying, listen, unless you want to reform our club completely, this job may not be for you. And Ferguson went down with his script, which was, I want to reform this club completely, because if that's not what you want me to do, I'm not the man for you. And it was just a complete meeting of minds. And from then on, I mean, within 5 minutes of them sitting down together in, I think it was Martin Edwards' car, there was no question of the deal not the hands not being shaken and the announcement not being made.
Interesting. I completely agree. We've talked about this before, the sort of cult of personality, and for a while, you mentioned Docky and Sexton and their contrasts. I think for a while the idea of personality became more important than the substance of what they were trying to bring, because the idea was that the substance was there when it wasn't, and obviously the sort of transitional time had overtaken that as well. But I am interested to know, every single manager came in, obviously, with this idea of a long-term goal, because I don't think at Manchester United and other institutional football clubs like an Arsenal or Liverpool, you don't hire a manager to hire them for 2 seasons. Well, you didn't then. You hired them for a longer period of time. You looked at this sort of... And maybe that's true of every football club. Maybe I'm not trying to be... turn my nose up at anyone else, but certainly at the sort of the big clubs where you were...
Liverpool, you could bracket Liverpool with Manchester United in that sense.
Absolutely.
Let's the boot room. Exactly. And United, to their internal credit, were thinking long term when they appointed Alex Ferguson. I don't know if they ever, certainly neither of them ever envisaged 26 years, but they certainly envisaged a decade.
And what do you think when they were getting Ferguson? I think that pretty much we can all ascertain from what happened with the Atkinson reign and why he was dismissed that the goal within that 10 years was to win a league title. But what else do you think that they were hoping? I mean, I guess Edwards has looked at what he'd done at Aberdeen, he'd looked at what he'd done at St Mirren and sort of said, okay, well, we can break the Liverpool stranglehold and maybe establish a team that can not only win 1 title, maybe 2, and then obviously we talked about the younger players as well. So these were all the kind of things that, like you said, it was a perfect meeting of the minds, this meeting of ideals.
Yes, but United, I think, were hoping for a little bit more than that. They were hoping for discipline, because the discipline within the club, within most clubs, wasn't what it is today. I mean, I'm talking about drink, basically, and allied things. Obviously, if you're on your 3rd pint, you don't think, I'm not going to spend the whole day in the pub. Drink leads to other things, and I mean, the whole discipline at the club was not good. It wasn't great in football, but Manchester United were conscious that it needed to be done. And Ferguson was aware of it because, of course, through his enduring friendship at that time with Gordon Strachan, they would talk while Ferguson was still at Aberdeen. They would talk, and Strachan, not knowing that he was snitching, because not knowing that Ferguson was going to be the manager, said, "Oh, there's a few drinkers down here, boss." Oh my God! And so Ferguson was well aware, and when he asked Martin Edwards, "Is there a drink culture at the club?" he knew what the answer was going to be. So, that was another thing that needed to be sorted out, which he did with. When you look back on it, the most extraordinary, brave decisions. He had 3 top players, all of whom he needed. Because when he got to Old Trafford, one thing that the team lacked a lot, but in terms of where Manchester United wanted to go, but one thing that it lacked was strength, physicality. It was a team of Olsen and good players. Though he and Arthur Albiston, Peter Davenport, they weren't the guys who could knock you out of the way. They had to play the way. And Terry Gibson, Colin Gibson, you could go through loads of Johnny Sivbeck. Not one of them was intimidating, but he had 2 intimidating players who were intimidating, who had good physiques, and there were Norman Whiteside and Paul McGrath. But they were two of his three biggest problems in terms of addressing the drink culture. The third was Brian Robson. But Brian Robson was simply too good. He was too good a pro, too good a player, too good. He liked to drink, but there was no. Ferguson said, "Look, because there's no way I'm going to get rid of Brian Robson, one of the best players in Europe. I'm going to reluctantly have to get rid of two of my biggest assets on the field, which were Norman Whiteside and Paul McGrath." And that he did. Looking back on it, he got rid of a United legend and probably one of the greatest players that's ever played for the Republic of Ireland, and definitely a candidate for best centre-half I've ever seen in my life in Paul McGrath, and not too shabby in midfield.
Yeah.
So these were top assets that he sacrificed on the way to rebuilding Manchester United as a club and changing the culture.
Absolutely, Paddy. But it's also worth noting, while because obviously we're covering this era, that took 2 or 3 years to happen. So there was certainly a period of time where he looked at what he had and obviously what he was inheriting, and certainly in the first 2 years, inevitably at the end, as we all saw, that they became collateral damage and sort of examples of the standard that Ferguson was setting. But for the first 2 years, it was very much a case of, how do I turn this around and get them on side?
Yeah, he didn't go in guns blazing. You see, that's the other thing. We think now of Ferguson in retrospect as a firebrand who didn't take any prisoners and who threw the bad apples out of the dressing room and all this kind of stuff. No, he was much too crafty for that. He went in knowing that if he did go in with an axe and apply an axe to the dressing room, that he would last about as long as Brian Clough did at Leeds. And no, he was much too clever for that. He was actually, he would lose his rag at times if the performance wasn't to his satisfaction, but it was, there was a lot of nurture as well. There was a lot of long, canniness and cleverness in knowing what he could do. I don't think he went into the market straight away. He had been told by Martin Edwards that there was no money available. And yet, when after, as you say, a period of a couple of years, when he decided what he needed, the money actually did become available. He was very good at wheedling money out of Martin. It was always a tension between them in every possible way. But Martin Edwards did provide the money for the likes of Pallister. Funnily, Danny Wallace, I talked before about needing to increase the size and power of the team, particularly when McGrath and Whiteside left. Danny Wallace was hardly fitted the bill of a strong man, but Bruce and Pallister did, and that they were the foundations of the revival in the way that they were two defenders that they were they were fierce as well as gifted on the ground.
We'll talk about the entirety of Ferguson's first season in our next episode, but I just want to run over the first couple of games. Obviously, the first ever game he played, he coached United, was at Oxford United's Manor Ground, where they lost 2-0. The team sheet for that has infamously gone to auction many times. I'm not even sure that it's the original that's up there for auction anymore. Maybe they've some crafty guy with good duplicates there, but I mentioned the first couple of
Clayton Blackmore, a friend of this podcast, he would have been in that team.
Absolutely, he was, yeah. And a couple of games later, the reason why I mention these first few games is because he talked about Gordon Strachan telling tales. He'd also told the United players some tales about Alex Ferguson, which was expect the hairdryer. And the first hairdryer actually came in his first month in charge. They were down at Wimbledon at Plough Lane, where I'm delighted that, funnily enough, we are recording this podcast the day before the anniversary of Alex Ferguson arriving at United, and a couple of days after Wimbledon return to Plough Lane, so a nice bit of symmetry there. But United lost down at Wimbledon, this was symbolic of this Manchester United team. They would lose at places like Wimbledon, and they get bullied quite horrendously doing so. And it was after that game where the first hairdryer came out, where I think even the United players who'd been warned to expect it by Strachan were still surprised by how vociferous their new manager could be. Well, that's it for this first episode of Fergie United and how he arrived. Our next episode is going to focus on the early days as he made his mark at Old Trafford.
Was